Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, let me address you with a very warm welcome and extend my best greetings to all of you. It is with tremendous joy that I see so many of you and that we have this gathering here. I believe that also many of us realized over the last few weeks when we came back together in person what was lost during the pandemic and how important it is to meet in person again and talk. Gladly, after the pandemic or at the end of it, hopefully, travel is also possible again. And I raised this point because I had the chance last week to attend the joint assembly in Strasbourg by the ACP and EU member states. And I mentioned this because it showed me once again how important it is to meet between Europeans and Africans, that there remains to be done many things to get to know each other better. And I'm also saying this, so this was obvious to me, I'm also saying this as someone who now spent about 10 good years here on the continent and with the continent. I strongly believe, and this is what I wanted to say in my welcoming remarks, that we have to travel more into both directions, that we have to spend more time with each other, that we have to talk more, exchange more, also eat and drink together, also sometimes pray together, and that we should make it a habit to visit our cities, villages, and communities on both continents to better understand each other and also better understand the daily problems that both of us face every day in our different countries. I strongly believe that this is a precondition in order to make our European-African partnership make it work for us. And I think we really have to work hard on this. It is not for granted. So as we convene today here as Africans and Europeans, I'm very happy that so many of you followed the invitation. I think we have also a good amount of audience and guests virtually. I hope that we as Adenauer Foundation can contribute to this, make a small contribution to this exchange and dialogue, and as we have done over the last 70 years and by today in more than 120 countries. As you could see on our program, we do not only have very distinguished guests, but also a very special one who joined us from Germany, Mr. Roderich Kiesewetter, Member of Parliament from the Christian Democratic Union. He is serving and has been doing so for many years on our Foreign Committee in the German Parliament. And he is really at the forefront of many of the debates that we have in the German Parliament at the EU level also. So when it comes, for example, questions such as Mali, Afghanistan, and of course also Ukraine at the moment. So thank you very much for being with us. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very happy to see this, that you're here. We hope that we can show you this week also a good part of Ethiopia and also at the African Union. And by this also create better understanding for Africa in general, which has increasingly become important over the last years for German foreign policy. Today, we exchange about and engage in a very important discussion. And perhaps it is, I don't know that the EU colleagues know this better, but perhaps it is one of the first few events in public on this initiative that is called the Global Gateway. The Global Gateway is the EU strategy, and I quote, and I will not say too much about it, to boost smart, clean, and secure links in digital energy and transport, and strengthen health, education, and research systems across the world. I think it is an answer and also an offer after the COVID-19 pandemic to like-minded partners, and a focus of this new initiative is Africa. And about this we will talk today. And we will do so, I think, with a very great lineup of panelists, which I will introduce, or which we will introduce in a moment. And if I may, and then I'm coming also to the end of my welcoming remarks, three key guiding questions I would say we should ask: what is this initiative about? Where can it support? And also, last but not least, what do the African partners think about it? And with no further ado, I would now like to invite Her Excellency Birgitte Markussen, head of the EU delegation to the African Union, to give the keynote. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you all here. We have really been, and I say we, because when you talk about the Global Gateway, this, as you can imagine, this is a huge initiative. So it has really taken a lot of efforts, and it will take many more to get it actually implemented. Thank you very much for hosting this discussion today. It is one of the first public discussions of the Global Gateway. I, of course, would also like to acknowledge the German MP being here, Roderich Kiesewetter. It's a pleasure also to have you here. We have, I would say, also my colleague, Stefan Auer, German ambassador. We have quite a strong EU group here. So, but of course, also a warm welcome to African colleagues and to other colleagues in the room and on the net. What I will do is I will talk, and you can go to the next one. We have prepared because I wanted to make sure there are some key information here when we discuss this. So in this keynote, I want to address, first of all, what you see here is really what we call the sustainable connections that work for people. And this is about connecting people in the European way. It is about our offer, as was just said, for connecting the world with investments and partnerships. It is the countries where we can cooperate in creating better living conditions and tackling what we call the global challenges of today, the climate change, global health, which we know is the whole issue of also getting economies back after the COVID-19 crisis. It's sustainable development, a word that entails a lot, but what is really about what I said before, this is about something that works for people, that improving lives. And then the last thing about the stronger supply chains. This is about getting economies back, it's about getting development, and it's about creating results for, again, the people. So this is the brief outline. I'm also going to talk about the European approach to this. I'm going to talk about the package as such that we launched at the EU-AU summit on the 17th, 18th February in Brussels. And of course, give you some outline of the, let's say, of the actual results. And my colleagues will know that I'm very enthusiastic when it comes to showing you the maps of the real connections that we think would make a difference. So they are part of this presentation. It's to give you a bit of a cliffhanger there. But you can go to the next. If I talk about the European approach here, what we have tried to do is to say, we need to invest in the hard infrastructure, but also in the soft infrastructure. And what does that mean? It obviously means physical infrastructure, but it also means the whole thing that we call the enabling environment. How do we get the investments? How do we get the transparency to have the investments, to have the right companies, to have the right actors actually come and do these infrastructure investments? So we are trying to think both this, what I would say, enabling environment, is also the governance structures related to it. So that's a part of what I call the European way. What I also want to say, in preparations for the EU-AU summit, we had a lot of good discussions at the highest level. And what I could see the European leaders and the African leaders were talking about was exactly, let's have a cooperation between the European Union and the African Union and member states that really looks at, let's get the infrastructure, let's get something visible that can get the economy going. I will get back to what that is actually on the ground. Next slide, please. So if we look at this investment package that was launched as part of the EU-AU summit, it says that we are going to have a regional investment plan that would at least reach 150 billion euro. And that is the Global Gateway Initiative for Africa. Africa was the first region where we actually met after the Gateway was launched in December by von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. So Africa was the first region where we sat down and tried to discuss what will it mean. And of course, we still have, I'm sure we will also discuss today. I'll try to give a bit of the outlines that are there, but of course, it has to link into what we're doing together. So the package is looking at 5 issues, as you can see on this slide. It looks at green transition. We know for our partnership, the transition is quite important. Digital transformations, it looks at the growth and decent job creation, health systems, and into education and training. Next, please. Now I'm digging into some of the actual examples of what is in the package. The ambition is here by 2030 to accelerate universal access for all in Africa to reliable internet networks, safely and securely wherever they live. And this is going to take place by bringing in what we call the innovation ecosystems in Africa. But what it really means is to link them to European ones that, for instance, is what you see under what we call the Africa-Europe Digital Innovation Bridge. So what you will also see here, we also talk about cloud, investment in cloud and data infrastructures, regulatory framework that are human-centered, and the structures that we have for dialogue, like what we call the Digital for Development Hub. What you see here is really also building, obviously, on some of the networks and some of the structures that are there. But let me turn to the next one. Good, because as I said, I really like these maps because they make it very visible what we're actually talking about in practice at the moment. So you can see when we talk about digital infrastructures here, we're trying to see how we can connect and do connectivity between Africa and Europe, and also reinforce the interconnections within Africa. You can see, not surprisingly, there's quite some activity around Southern Africa, but there's also some in Northern Africa and some about the Western Africa. It will be a challenge that we need to discuss if we are going to have the ambition of bringing internet access to all by 2030. How do we actually do this? But there is a great package there, so I think it is important to dig deeper into this. As you can see, we are looking at submarine also cables. We're looking at terrestrial fiber optic cables and satellite communication systems or connection systems. If we then move on to the strategic corridors, that is also another of my own favorites, because here the ambition is really to connect investments in a limited number of strategic corridors. In the preparations for the summit, and every time you discuss economics and development in Africa, but also in Europe, you actually need to look at how do you connect the dots, literally. How do you connect the power centers with the periphery and so on and so forth? So we are looking at this and what we call a clean and efficient corridors, multimodality and climate ambition is that when I in a minute go to the next slide, you will see that these corridors, they are not just, trains or roads, they are kind of quite elaborate in terms of what is needed to get the economy going. Please take the next one. So there you can see, and this is actually also very much, we've been looking into, of course, the PIDA plans of the African Union, the investment plans, but here you see what we would suggest under the Global Gateway, 11 strategic corridors. You will see there is, we are looking at how to connect key countries in West Africa. We are looking at how actually to connect from East to West Africa, and also up to North Africa, and then also looking at some strategic corridors in Southern Africa. The ones that you see in yellow are our suggestion for the strategic ones. You will see there are some gray ones, so it means there are existing and there are other corridors, but this is where we see the European Union could play an active role together with our African partners. Next, please. So it's also quite important, as I said, what about energy? Because apart from infrastructure, apart from corridors, what we've also heard and what we've discussed in our discussions between European Union and African Union is the importance of access to energy across the African continent. We know that that is what can kickstart a lot of developments. So we are looking at also as part of the global gateway for some regional electricity interconnections and also market integration. And we look at the transition. How do we actually transition? We know if you look at climate change and energy consumption, we know how important it is to invest in the transition and not just focus on whether it's brown or green, but actually also going from the transition, how do we get to the green when we have the brown energy? And then we also have clean hydrogen productions in Africa. Now I come to my last slide where I try to sum up and very ready to have some discussions and questions. So I just would like to end by saying, what's the strategic role of Africa-AU for European Union, as I'm obviously here representing the European Union. For us, it's really both Africa, member states, and the African Union. They are our natural partners, we're neighbors. What we can get by connecting, as you saw on these connectivity initiatives, the corridors, the digital, would really play a major role if we look at the economics of development and of course of integration. This would also link into AFCFTA and the type of trade agreements we have in Europe. The second point I want to underline is what we're looking at is looking really at the quality results, focusing on the strategically connected priorities that I have just presented to you. Let's talk about what corridors would make a difference, what type of digital access and access to energy, where would it really matter, both in terms of being inclusive and in terms of getting the economies going, of course, with a focus on the people. So this is really where I want to end. I think we are neighbors, and if you look at geography, that really matters. Also, when you talk about connectivity, how do we connect our economies? Our people are already connected by history, by culture, and so on. How can we reinforce this? You know, the experience of Europe is really that economic integration was what built our peace. It's what built the economies. I will stop there. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Start our discussion. Okay, go in the middle there. Be on the edge. Wonderful. We can now start our first panel. I think we have about a good hour, including also questions. And I will just say a few words about the type of panels that we have today. The first panel is more about the Global Gateway Initiative in general. We want to clarify it a bit further. We want to look at which role this new initiative has also in the strategic partnership with Africa. which was highlighted also the initiative at the recent EU-AU summit, as we heard from Her Excellency Markussen. And we also want to see, as Europe and Africa really need each other, I think, we also want to ask which areas the Global Gateway Initiative can support, where it can make the existing partnership that we have stronger, and also where it can support Africa on its path towards growth and industrialization. The second panel, which will be more technical and more practical, we will talk on existing initiatives and infrastructure projects, which are closely aligned with an initiative by the African Union Commission in cooperation with the UNECA and also the African Development Bank. We will hear more about those projects, what they are, where maybe also challenges are, and how they are on track. I would like just to introduce our excellent panelists, and I'm really, really happy that we are together here. And I will start again with Her Excellency, Ms. Markussen, Birgitte Markussen. She's from Denmark. She is a career diplomat of the Danish Foreign Service. She served as ambassador of Denmark in Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and the Central African Republic from 2012 to 15. You were the director for Africa at the Danish Foreign Ministry, and then you served as the deputy manager for Africa at the European External Action Service, not Exchange Service. We have an exchange service with the Germans. And since 2020, you are the head of the EU delegation here to the African Union, and I think you are the fourth ambassador in this role. On the screen, we have Rashid Ali Abdallah, Executive Director of the African Energy Commission, who joins us live now from Algeria. Very welcome also to you. It's great to have you. Mr. Abdallah, he is from Sudan originally. He is a trained mechanical and energy engineer with degrees from Khartoum and Birmingham University, and he has 20 years of experience in the energy sector. He worked as a senior mechanical engineer for several power plants in Sudan at the National Electricity Corporation. He then joined the Sudanese Thermal Power Generating Company as a project's planning department manager until 2013. And then he joined the AU Commission, where he served first as the acting head of the energy division. And in 2018, Mr. Abdallah assumed the role that he has at the moment, and he is filling as the executive director of AFREC, the African Energy Commission. We come to Mr. Kiesewetter from southern Germany, from a smaller city called Pfullendorf, 30 kilometers of our biggest lake, Lake Constance, Bodensee. Mr. Kiesewetter has a career in the military service. After your first military service, you studied economics in Munich and then in Austin, Texas. You then pursued your career in the German military. You served for the German military in Bosnia-Herzegovina. You worked at NATO headquarters, first in Brussels, later in Mons. You have been also several times to Afghanistan and on the Balkan. Since 2009, you have been serving as a directly elected member of parliament, and you are a rapporteur on the Foreign Committee for the Christian Democratic Union. And I also mentioned that you're a member of the French-German Joint Parliamentary Assembly and the Atlantic Bridge, which underlines, I think, also your commitment and dedication to Germany's historic partnerships with France and the US. And last but not least, I come to His Excellency Stefan Auer, German ambassador here in Ethiopia. Mr. Auer was born in Tanger, Morocco. You studied law at the University of Bonn. After that, you did a legal traineeship at a regional higher court, and then you joined the diplomatic service. Then still West Germany, I think that was 1988, and your first posting abroad was London, the UK, just a few months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I found in your CV very interesting that you served at the Foreign Ministry from 2010 to 12 as the Commissioner for Globalization, Energy and Climate Policy. Those were the years also for us in Germany where we somehow said goodbye to nuclear energy. It was the years of the Fukushima catastrophe. You then worked in Brussels for 3 years at the EEAS as Deputy Managing Director for Human Rights, Global and Multilateral Issues, From 2016 to 20, you were our ambassador in South Korea and Seoul. And since 2020, you are our ambassador here in Ethiopia. Thank you so much for joining us. Panel, we start now. And I ask the first question to Her Excellency Markussen. Where does the Global Gateway Initiative, and thank you very much again for your excellent presentation, where does it sit in the EU's general foreign policy?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It sits at the center at the moment. This is one of the very, very big, ambitious foreign policy, but also, I would say, also linked to European development initiatives. So it sits, but what I want to say is also, it's not by coincidence that Africa was the first region where we discussed this. Mm-hmm. You may remember that Ursula von der Leyen, only after 1 week in the office, she didn't go to Beijing or Washington, she went to Addis Ababa. And she actually brought a total of 22 commissioners out of the 27, quite a few months later, to a commission meeting. So it's all this attention towards the African continent from the European Commission, but also the External Action Service, mm-hmm. Where we, of course, have an integrated approach. So I would say, the last thing I would say, it sits at the center also because when you heard about, when Ursula von der Leyen took up her position, she said, I want a geopolitical commission. And that meant also that connecting, using the expertise in Europe also around the world. And I think that's also what you see in the package that I just presented, both with the hard investments and with the softer ones, thinking about the investment environments. So I think I can't sit here without also mentioning, because that's an important message to say, there's also a lot of competition on resources because of the crisis, the war we have in Europe at the moment on Ukraine. So I think it's also an extra important message from me today and from other Europeans, just to say we are looking beyond Europe still. We are still engaging, showing partnerships also in Africa. So it sits central. That's where it sits.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the integrated approach, and to some of our audience, this may sound a bit technical. What do you mean by it, and why is it so important?
It's because daily lives, if it's business or whatever, they are lived across sectors. And if you are in a crisis or whatever, you don't just have security needs. You have humanitarian needs, you have investment needs. So an integrated approach is trying to look at how can we, as the European Union, bring in both the development cooperation, the humanitarian assistance, the peace and security instruments, and also the global gateway. You saw on the map for the corridors, and in West Africa, it goes up to Niamey in Niger. It also goes via Burkina Faso. And we know what situation that region is in. And that's been one of the prime examples of how we have done integrated approaches. So it's really making things coming together. Thanks.
Thank you. And maybe as a last question for the time being, some people might say, oh, the EU, we had so many infrastructure projects. In which ways, I would be interested, does the Global Gateway Initiative differ from previous programs?
It differs in the way that we have learned together with our partners. So we don't only do the hardware, we also look at the enabling environment. Because if you build a road, if you have an investment in digital infrastructures, you need shops, you need infrastructure to bring products, you need let's say, the whole value chain work. You actually need to also to think about the environment and how do you actually attract investments. As I said before, the right investments that you do also by creating that environment for the investment. So I think that's the main difference of what. And then I don't think we haven't created that big strategic package. The total package is up to or more than 300 billion. So it's a big one. But of course, it's the results that count. We should not always talk figures.
That's
Thank
true.
you.
We will talk a little bit figures, because I will now ask the next question to Executive Director Abdallah. And energy plays a huge, very important role also in the Global Gateway Initiative, the infrastructure for the energy transition. Maybe as an opening question, Director Abdallah, I would like to know, so at the moment we have the contribution of Africa to global CO2 emissions between 3 and 4%. We all know that we need that that the continent gets electrifies itself. So I would be interested to know from you, how is this possible without critically increasing global CO2 emissions?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. And also thank you for your this distinguished panelist. Really, what you said is very correct, that the contribution of Africa to the global CO2 emission is very limited. It is between 3 and 4. But I will add also, if you omit or exclude the big country like Algeria, Egypt, and South Africa, the rest of Africa remain with only 1% or around 1%. That means in most of African countries that we can see the power system, it is not yet built. And this very good opportunity, we start fresh. We start depending on renewable energy. And the Gateway Initiative, I think it is come in the right time. We are talking in the era of energy transition. And I think this initiative and also the other initiative can help the African country to build their system away from the traditional resources. When it is come to renewable energy, I think Africa is rich with the renewable energy in many resources. When we talk about solar energy, Africa can have like 10 terawatts of energy. Hydro, we have massive hydro, which is estimated like 350 gigawatts. We have wind energy, which is around 110 gigawatts. And really, thermal in East Africa also, in Ethiopia and Kenya also is a massive. And we have also unlimited bioenergy resources. And I think these all resources is there. And I think this will enable Africa to pave the road to have clean energy transition. And actually, maybe this is also a good opportunity for Gateway to involve and to try to realize these resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And you touched upon a few things. So you mentioned solar energy. You mentioned also the potential of hydro, water. You also mentioned windcraft, I think. So maybe for our audience, could you give 1 or 2 examples where, from your point of view, it is really visible that a clean transition to clean energy, green energy, is possible on a large scale? That would be, I think, interesting for our audience to know.
Okay, this is a good question. And I think in Africa, there is so many amazing experience that prove the possibility of the energy transition. Maybe I can just mention 3 or 4. When you look at South Africa, which is heavily dependent on coal, I think they have very amazing program, which is renewable energy independent power producer program, which is started in 2010. And as I speak, this program can attract investment for 6,000 megawatts. And still, this is a 5th round. And I think the structure of this program also show, even with the heavy dependence on coal, still country can pave the way to the energy transition. And also, I need to remind you also, Africa is a house of the largest PV solar power plant in Egypt. This Binpan power plant, which is another modality, which is the installed capacity is 1,660 megawatts. And also, I need also to remind you about this Wazazat complex in Morocco, which is also include the largest centralized solar power plant in the world. So this really, you can see any project, they have a specialized modality that can work. And this, since Africa is big, I think this could be also a lesson learned. And I don't need to forget the amazing work happening in Kenya, the geothermal. After 4 decades, where they start this geothermal as a research, now the geothermal energy produce 50% of the power generation in Kenya. And I think if you look at all this, you can find that we have different resources, we have with the different models, and I think we can give several success and several models that can be duplicated in another area.
Thank you very much. You said in your first answer that you believe that the Global Gateway Initiative comes at the right time. And the EU and the AU, or the EU member states and the African Union member states, have been partners in the energy sector for quite some time. We know about the EU-AU energy partnership, for example, which is, I think, a bit older than 10 years. How do you see the cooperation between two blocks, between two continents, and also, hand on the heart, from your point of view, where could be more support? Where could the cooperation also improve, as we always seek for improvement?
Yeah, thank you very much. And also, I would like to thank Her Excellency Ambassador, where they say that we are partner, we are near to each other. I think we have also the same understanding. And this energy partnership, I think it is a national partnership, as is mentioned before. And when I look at where the area that this partnership can improve, I think the capacity building, it is the one area. Knowledge transfer, it is the other area. And also, of course, Africa, they have a huge resources, but also I think it is the right time now to support the manufacturing of renewable energy facilities in Africa. This will create jobs for the African people and also will accelerate the filling the gap of the energy. Regulatory framework, it is the other areas that need to be improved. The creating enable environment for private sector to participate in this transition is also the area that it could be included. But I think when we talk about energy and energy transition, this is a learning process, and I think work together, and of course we can explore more area to be tackled together.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Auer. Why is the initiative, the Global Gateway Initiative, important to Germany?
Question. All right. Hello. First of all, before we dive into this question, let me just briefly pick up what Birgitte, the EU ambassador to the EU, has just alluded to, and that is the geopolitical context, because this discussion takes place in a geopolitical context. It's not in the vacuum we are talking about. And we see here since the 24th of February, a complete change of the global political situation when Russia attacked Ukraine. We see here that there's a blatant violation of the international order, of the rules-based international order, and we have to see to it that this, of course, draws the attention, the political attention of the world, in particular also in Europe, on the situation, financially also, we have to admit that, and resource-wise. So what does that mean for us? The German government and here also the EU is very interested in not to divert the attention from Africa to Europe, to this conflict there. But we have to be honest, this is a competition for resources. And this competition for limited resources will increase the longer this war takes place. So it is in the interest of everybody around this table here in this room, Africans and Europeans, that this war stops as soon as possible. And it can only stop by the one who has started it, and that's President Putin. So we have to join our forces to call on him to stop this war immediately. And that is something we should jointly strive to, because we need to reestablish the international world order and the rules-based order. Why? Because coming now back to the global initiative, this is the context. The rules-based order is the environment, the conducive environment Birgitte was talking about. So we all have an interest in enabling this global gateway initiative, but this presupposes that we have an international order back in place. So this is what I just wanted to say in the beginning by way of introduction. So what is Germany's interest in the global gateway? I think the key sentence in all this is that infrastructure is key for development and trade. You know that Germany is one of the major trading powers in the world, and it has a keen interest in the prosperous Africa, not only for ethical, humanitarian reasons, but also for our own economic interests. We don't want to continue ad infinitum to deliver humanitarian or development assistance. We would like much more to trade. And the Global Gateway Initiative is one precondition, because infrastructure is the basis, as I said, the key for development and trade. You have to know that every fourth job in Germany depends on the export. So we are very interested in engaging with new partners, in particular in Africa, and infrastructure can increase the accessibility to markets which have been difficult to reach up to now. But of course, we want to do this in contrast to some initiatives which are already existent by some other countries, to do this in a sustainable way. In a sustainable way in its three dimensions: economically, environmentally, financially, and qualitative wise. So environmentally, because this has to contribute in a good way to climate change mitigation. So we need to have this green transition. We have to build the infrastructure in the CO2 neutral way as far as possible. We have to do it in a qualitative, high qualitative way so that the maintenance costs do not exceed too much the capabilities of our partners. And we have to do it in a way which creates jobs and which creates added value change in the region here. So this is what we are very interested in, because we think that a prosperous developing Africa is very much in the interest of Germany and of the European continent, because we are neighbors, we depend on each other. The future of Europe depends on the future of Africa and vice versa. Also, the future of Africa depends on the future of Europe, that we have a peaceful and order in Europe as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The initiative was created also in the light of the global COVID-19 pandemic, which also brought today to light problems that we have in global supply chains. We also felt it here on the continent, also when it came to vaccines, for example. I would like to ask you, where do you see gaps in global supply chains? And maybe where could Germany make a difference in the framework of the initiative?
Well, we have seen during the pandemic that some gaps in the global supply chains have been revealed. You see that in the pharmaceutical area. The pandemic revealed that we knew it already before, but 90% of the pharmaceutical products of medicine has to be imported to Africa. This is definitely a gap we have to address. We have that in the manufacturing area. We have that in the electronics area. We have this in the automotive element as well, or sector as well. So these are all gaps we need to address and which the Global Gateway can contribute to address. When you ask me about the German contribution to all this, we are contributing to this through the EU. You know, we are the biggest contributor to them. A quarter of her salary is paid by Germany. You're welcome. No, but honestly, I think the Germany is one of the biggest contributors, and I think it is very important that a quarter of the investments of the EU taking place here is financed by Germany. As we have also got national initiatives which are included in the Team Europe initiative. And of course, we are contributing through the AU, through the PIDA projects, which you have just mentioned. I think this is very important. And when I just can pick up one very specific contribution by a German company, which is the BioNTech company, which is establishing production facilities now in Senegal and Rwanda, and which in the coming months will start, you know, its operation, and will see to it that after a year now, also Africa will be able to produce its own vaccines in mRNA vaccines. So it is a very sophisticated, highly high quality vaccines which we're able to supply the African continent with vaccines.
Thank you very much. We now come to the Parliament. Mr. Kiesewetter, I would like to ask you, how do you see in general this new initiative, the Global Gateway? I also want to ask you, maybe compared to, and Ambassador, our mentioned initiatives by other countries. So another big one is the Silk Road initiative from China. How do you see it, this initiative also in the global competition of systems?
Yeah, thank It's a cyber attack. I try to do it this way. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation, dear Mr. Müchler, and I'm really delighted and would like to express my gratitude to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and also to this excellent panel. Well, if we talk about the Global Gateway Initiative, we also need to see where the European Union is coming from. Until 2004, we have had a huge enlargement process. And not only until 2004, but also including the Euro crisis until 2012, the European Union was focused too much on itself. It was not looking further abroad what was being achieved by others in Africa, on the Balkans, in the Near Middle East, in the whole MENA region as well. And since the migration challenges from 2014, the European Union started different initiatives based on a security strategy which was really black-eyed from 2003. She revised a lot of its acquis, of her acquis. I would like to mention a new strategic strategy from 2016. I also would like to mention the current work on the European Compass, which is a security-oriented development which will be achieved probably by mid-June. And then we had the European Green Deal, which is also very much focused on renewable energies, not encompassing all the challenges in our environment the ambassador has just mentioned. So all in all, the Global Gateway Initiative is a late answer to megatrends, to global challenges, but I believe it's an appropriate answer. It is included in a greater strategy of the European Union, but if we want the success of it, the European Union needs to carefully listen in two directions, or at least in three. One is the partners. What are the interests of the partners? For example, the African nations and the African Union member states and the African Union as a body. So what are the interests? And do we fit with our offer the interests? Do we match and meet the interests? So we cannot afford to offer something which is not needed, and we cannot offer something which we force others to do. So it must be really even-handed. That's the one direction to our partners. The other direction is to our competitors. For example, to Russia, to Turkey, which is now very close to the European Union, and to China. It is not the reply to the Silk Road Initiative. It's an own approach to connectivity, which is also alluding to the needs in our immediate neighborhood. And third, we also need to look very carefully to the interests of the population of the European Union member states. We need to convince them that we need, as Europeans, to engage abroad. Why? We are only 500 million. We are a graying continent. We now have about nearly 500 million inhabitants, and we will have 500 million inhabitants by the end of the century. Whereas Africa will have about 4 billion people. It will double its population from 1.4 billion people to 2.5 billion people by 2050. But it will go up to 4 billion people. So the European survival is depending from a close and even-handed cooperation with Africa. And therefore, we need also to convince the European population that they invest in connectivity, that they are open-minded for legal migration, that they are willing to invest also in vocational training abroad, that we create a kind of resilience, as Ambassador Markussen has just said, a kind of resilience regarding a sustainable approach to our resources. And as regards the African continent, we should avoid that Africa repeats our own mistakes regarding carbon-oriented industries and regarding a lack of connectivity we have in the European Union. So just go for 5G and 6G, just go for fiber and not for copper and so on. So to learn also from the mistakes from the European Union and even the United States. A last remark to your question. The European Union needs also to closer cooperate with the United States of America and Canada, because they will invest much more in the Indo-Pacific region. They will obviously look for the free sea lines of communication in the Indo-Pacific. So there is even a need for the European Union for burden sharing with the United States. As it was mentioned, the rules-based international order is under pressure. We see it regarding the assessment of the Ukrainian war, the war of Russia against Ukraine. So I believe that the European Union needs to formulate its interests, should be more focused, and should be a trustful partner to Africa.
Thank you very much. Germany, the German government supports the Global Gateway Initiative. You are a member of parliament. The parliament controls the government, and also the CDU is, for the moment, no longer the ruling party. I would like to know, in the eyes and ears of taxpayers from Europe and Germany, do you have reservations? Do you have open questions that should be answered when it comes to that initiative? Because we talk about a lot of money.
Yes, well, but not to invest will cost even more, because we will avoid modernization. And the normal German taxpayer, the European Union, is costing €1 a day. So all in all, the return on investment is much higher than that what is paid. And we need to convince our people. And I believe that's the task for parliamentarians. I had the chance today to talk to members of the Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Ethiopian Parliament, including the head of the Committee of Foreign Affairs. And it is very helpful if parliamentarians talk to each other. We need to convince our population. And if our population is criticizing us, normally the people are right. So we have to listen carefully, and we have to improve our performance in listening to the people, in better controlling the governance, and therefore to enable a good relationship between the population and the pillars of a state, the judicial pillar, the legislative pillar, and the governmental pillar. And those who are dovetailing this, these are the parliamentarians. So it's a key role to convince and not to wait. It's a key role to be innovative and to make proposals, and also to defend, but to defend the system by improving it, by being open-minded for innovation.
Thank you. My last question to you for the time being. You already talked about it, and also Ambassador Markussen and also Ambassador Auer. We have now this war in Ukraine, and you also talked about the increasing role of Africa for Europe. I would like to ask you how important is an industrialized Africa for Europe, and especially also in the light of the war that we have at the moment?
I believe that we will have a more challenging question. That's the question of nutrition, of agricultural performance. The question, who will provide Africa with cereals if Russia and Ukraine won't do or can't do it? And therefore we need sustainable supply chains. And the role of the European Union should be to open its market more even-handed for the products from Africa, and not to suppress by bringing in own products from agricultural areas. So what we need is to build up even-handed supply chains. In my constitutional area, there are several enterprises who, for example, invest in Tunisia, or Voigt is investing in the Grand Dam, Renaissance Dam, Voigt turbines, creating electrical power. So what we need is to assist, to advise, and to help to create jobs here, which are not dependent from European investment, but which see European investment as a catalyst for vocational training, for own supply chains. So we should not see Africa as an object of development money and development aid, but as an even-handed partner who is able to formulate its own interest, and therefore we should find a field, a level where we can combine our interests. And for Europe, for example, we need sustainable supply chains in Africa, but also we need skilled workers for legal temporary migration, for example, in Germany or other areas. So we should see the Mediterranean ocean as a bridge and not as a border. We should improve connectivity. And then I see also a chance to overcome that what we just experienced in Europe with the war, that we find a system, say this as a former officer working at NATO and European Union, where we find trust building measures, where we find arms control systems, and where we find also an idea to limit the national investments in defense, because we in parallel invest in trust building measures and transparent verification measures, which help to increase mutual trust instead of investing in mutual arms. I find this would be also a way out in a peace-oriented, negotiation-oriented approach in a cooperation amongst the European Union and the African Union.
Thank you. Ambassador Markussen, private sector plays a very big role in this initiative, and I would like to know how can be European investors, how can be companies in general be attracted? What are there for challenges? What kind of securities do we perhaps still need to create? We have this discussion also in Germany, but what is necessary and which role will European companies also play? Because I think also the interest here in Africa, on the African side, is also to have quality investment, to have quality companies from Europe. Absolutely.
And to add to what I also said before, I think what is innovative, and you asked me what's new in this global gateway, and the role of the private sector, bringing them in and creating the environment that is needed if you want a broad variety of investors. I was sitting 2 years actually on the board of the European Investment Bank, giving advice on the geopolitics of, because the bank has wanted for a long time actually to make investments outside Europe. it's actually not everybody knows that it's larger, its portfolio is larger than the World Bank. So getting the European Investment Bank into this, and it is acting based on guarantees that is part of the mix that we are offering in the Global Gateway. So I think to attract the private sector is exactly getting that mix right, where you look at the investment environment, you give the guarantees, you get the big players in like the European Investment Bank. It's a bit what we discussed before of the integrated approach, so that and that will provide the environment for the private sector to invest. Luckily in Europe, I mean, it's our member states who have the private sector. So we have to get actors, but I remember from my own time as Danish ambassador, luckily there is private sector that is ready and also to explore. And then there is also a big majority still that are looking at the environment and the investment environment. And that is where we come in with this big global gateway, with all the various initiatives that can create the right environment for this type of things to happen. And of course, with the African private sector. If you look at some of the maps I showed of the connectivity, connecting these powerhouses on the African continent, that is also extremely important, because I have seen some of the most innovative African private sectors, I would say really leapfrogging. We know it in Nigeria, in Kenya, South Africa, but also other places, Burkina Faso, where I was stationed, have West Africa's largest solar energy park, and so on and so forth. I'll end there.
And what are the next steps now after the EU-AU summit? It's still a nascent initiative. Where are we going in the next few months, maybe years?
No, this is, we are exactly looking at the maps I shared with you. We are exactly looking at how do we get the mechanism and the coordination in place so that we get all the players, member states, African partners, and of course we're working with the African Union Commission to see how we can make this happen. And that's going to, we are planning what we call a commission to commission meeting over the next few months, and then there will be planned a ministerial. So we will have to report and get some results and planning ready for that. So we're looking, one of the innovations from the summit was that we wanted to look in a more action-oriented way of the follow-up. So we are right now sitting, looking at the map, saying, okay, what are the main initiatives that we together with our African partners think will actually make a difference? And where can we make it happen? So the follow-up that we're looking at, and then of course we have all these high level also, there will be European politicians following this. So we are there to deliver. So I think that's the important part, the follow-up.
Thank you. We keep an eye on the time because we also want to allow questions from the audience. Director Abdallah, curious mind I am, you know, we picture an electrified continent. We will have pipelines across borders. We will have high transmission lines. I would like to know which role will EFREC play as a coordinating agency, as a coordinating commission. And since we know what these cross-border projects can also potentially create, it can also create tension. And we have an example now in Germany between Russia and Germany, Nord Stream 2. What is also the role of EFREC and also the AU Commission when it comes to trying to prevent potential conflicts ahead of time, mediate also?
Thank you very much. Really, one of the major agenda of Agenda 2063 is the integration. The African Union and with the approval of the African member state, they are put this Agenda 23 as the heart of all our work. So this integration means we have more roads, cross-border road, we have more transmission line, we have more pipeline for fuel or natural gas. And I think from the African point of view, We are working with our REX because it is building block of the African Union. We are working with our power pool, working with our regional regulators and also national regulator to ensure this harmonization and to ensure the smooth operation of cross-border infrastructure. And of course, as any trade, there are some dispute, and for any dispute, there are some certain institution within this energy institution to settle any raised dispute. And I think this is the way.
Thank you. My last question would go both to the ambassador and the member of parliament. You. Always the first one who asks, we say in German. I would like to start with you, Ambassador Auer. So we know from African partners, so Germany, I'm sorry, has a positive role many times when we listen in conversations, and there is also an opinion or the image Germany does good work, but why can't you do more? Why can't you do more compared to other partners, global partners, China, US, Turkey? What would you answer to this? How will German engagement, how will German commitment look in the future, maybe in the next 10 years? How important will Africa become in German foreign policy? And then, of course, also to you, Mr. Kiesewetter, the same question.
Thank you. Thank you. It doesn't work. Hello? Yes. Thank you very much for your question. I think that Africa is already one of the focal points of our foreign policy. We have seen this in various elements. You can see that during our G20 presidency, we developed this compact with Africa, for instance. Just as an example, we have developed the last German government, the guidelines for a new German Africa policy, for instance. These are just elements which demonstrate that Africa is very much a focus of German foreign policy, and this will remain so. Another example I can give to you, Germany is the biggest bilateral partner of the African Union. Of course, the EU is by far the biggest institutional partner, but we are the biggest bilateral partner. So this is just to show that we take this relationship to Africa very, very seriously, because as I said in my initial remarks, at the end of my initial remarks, our future in Europe depends very much on what is going on in Africa, and we have a fundamental interest in a prosperous, peaceful, and developed Africa. If I may, just looking into the future, because you also asked about what's going to happen in 10 years, because I want to take advantage of the presence of our African colleague here, who is virtually connected to us, and speaking about energy. The African continent up to now was very much known for exporting commodities, and its energy mix was very much based on coal and fuel. And I speak under the guidance, and that he should correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, coal, oil, these have been, and biomass have been the major energy sources in Africa. I think there's a huge potential for solar energy. There's something which is, this African continent is unrivaled when it comes to the potential for solar energy in the world. And if Africa exploits it, it can it can be a champion in the green transition to a CO2 neutral economy. And moreover, it can use the solar power, because the surplus solar power can be used to produce green hydrogen, which will be the future energy source, and which will be the fundamental prerequisite to have a worldwide transition from a CO2 intensive economy to a CO2 neutral economy. And here, just to give you a forecast, as far as I know, and I've seen the IMF projects for Africa, I think Africa in 2100 will have 60% of its energy production based on solar power. So this is a real potential for exporting solar power, or based on the solar power hydrogen, to Europe. Germany, for instance, 40 to 60% of its future energy supply will need to be hydrogen in order to enable the energy transition in Germany. So this is a very potential for a new partnership.
Thank you. Mr. Kiesewetter, should Germany do more in Africa?
Well, your question is very tricky. Why should Germany do more? Why not the European Union? And we have a lot of European Union member states who have diverging interests, also in Africa. And I see the role of Germany more or less in an intermediary role to combine the security interests of the Eastern European partners, who are very much focused on the Russian threat, and the Southern European partners who do not look to Eastern Europe at all, who are very much embraced by climate change and by migration, also legal and illegal migration from Africa. And therefore, the role of Germany is to mitigate the differences inside the European Union. We need to invest much more on the European level to better connect and dovetail the European endeavor. Second remark, I believe that it is outdated that every and each single European Union member state has an own development aid project. It should be renamed into a development assistant or something like that project, which is combined, which is coordinated by the European Union. We start with that in the G5 project Sahel and in the G12 project with Northern Africa and Sahel. However, this is only a starter. We have in a graying continent shrinking resources, and therefore we need to better combine these resources and connect. So I see the German role in an advocate for Africa inside the European Union to better combine the resources for a focused approach. And this focused approach should not be only in the interest of the European Union. We should ask what is requested. And a third remark, a European engagement and investment should not heal wrong projects of other investors from other continents. So we cannot afford to be the reserve for failed projects of others. That's a very tricky question. I hope I have answered it in this direction, because we need also in the EU-China summit a better common approach regarding the connectivity towards Africa and combined approaches. I would give an example. Voigt, which is also constructing the turbines for the Renaissance Dam, is investing in Congo in a huge project for a dam, which is costing more than 4 billion euros. You will find no single construction enterprise in the whole European Union which is able to construct such a huge dam. We have to cooperate with China, because you will nowhere on the world you will find an enterprise which is able to construct them except for China. So there is the question of competitiveness, the question of system rivalry, but also the question, how can we prevent the world from further crises? And there we need a very smart approach. And therefore I see this intermediary role as an intermediator of Germany inside the European Union.
Thank you very much. It's now time for questions. I would first collect 1-2 questions from the audience and then also add one from the chat box. Our team will help us here on the panel. If you ask your question, if you want, please briefly introduce yourself and please be brief, in solidarity for the other people who would like to ask questions. Who would like to ask a question? There is a hand. Mr. Alemno there, and I can give you the mic.
I'd like to appreciate the panelists My name is Abaran Deshau, working at the Ministry of Water and Energy, Senior Technical Advisor to His Excellency Dr. Engineer Abdamo. Hello, Ambassador. We have been together. Yes, I myself, with my minister, have been at the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue a week before. And we had many stakeholders there and very good initiatives going on around, especially on the green hydrogen energy, initiatives, the fashion agenda going on around. And we Africans have our own, demands and challenges, looking and seeking for, support. So we were very much lucky enough, for the facilitation made by the German embassy. His Excellency Ambassador has helped us a lot. And the Konrad Adenauer team in Germany, Berlin, we had the chance to visit with all the team there and a long list of companies, aside discussions, not less than 15, big companies in Germany. We had the discussion extending our stay in Germany, Berlin. So we are, working on how we could further strengthen our partnership with European companies and more specifically with Germany. And we have already tabled our agendas and our priority issues. So we, as the government of Ethiopia, are working on the issue of creating enabling environment. And Madam has already presented on her slides that this issue of a good playground and enabling environment matters a lot for business companies. The business companies are for-profit organizations and they want to have their return on investment. So my question is here, how are the technologies affordable? The affordability issue of the technologies and sustainability of technologies, accessibility of technologies. Once the installations are made, investments are made, this issue of affordability. We are a country with more than 110 million. This is an opportunity for Europe. Ethiopia is, some total of 3 African countries, maybe Kenya plus Uganda plus Rwanda plus maybe some more countries. So this is a potential. And more than 60 million Ethiopians are still living in darkness. We have a critical challenge in the power supply and access to energy services. So more than 80% of the national population is residing in the rural communities. So our demand is very huge, very high. The access to deficit, the energy access deficit by itself is an opportunity for the incoming investors and companies who are interested to invest in the country. But this issue of sustainability, affordability, accessibility of the technologies even. We have been trying many more projects, program initiatives across the different corners of the country. But unfortunately, we are not lucky enough, to move and step into expansion phase and scaling up phase for various reasons, which I can mention. Taking this into account, the government of Ethiopia is now currently working on power sector reform as part of the enabling environment. We are working on the green hydrogen energy policy, just under the coordination of the Federal Ministry of Finance. We are working on the new development and enactment of the green hydrogen energy policy and the public-private partnership modalities, so that the private investors could be attracted much more than ever, so that they can come up with and can be given guarantees from the government of Ethiopia. And we are trying our level best to create an enabling environment. The private sectors could invest more. But the second question I have on top of this is this issue of the technology types. For example, we are a country with a different topography. We have Dalol below sea level, 100 meter below sea level, and Ras Dashin around 4,600 above sea level. And the different options and alternatives for renewable energy technologies, be it wind energy or solar energy or green hydrogen energy. So how are these different technologies framed in the upcoming investment and partnership, and which ones are the most priorities. So my question is, how is the contextualizing and localizing of the investment and the partnership depending on the context in the respective state countries? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Abera. And that is a question which goes to whom of the panelists?
Just for either of the panelists, maybe.
Okay. Do we have another question from the audience? I would collect another one. Okay, we also have a good amount of questions from the virtual audience. The first one might be very easy to answer. There is a question, Ambassador Marquez, and can you share your presentation? Is this possible? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, we will find a way to share it. I think the colleagues are ready to share it. And the second question is a bit more difficult. It is from Professor Zakaria Getenga from Kenya. What exactly is each party bringing to the table in this initiative? Do some of the resolutions passed by parties need ratification by each party at the national level? Shall I repeat it? What do the different parties bring exactly to the table in this initiative? Do some of the resolutions passed by parties need ratification by each party? Maybe there's some clarification about resolutions, but yeah. I think we can leave it here for the moment, and we can start maybe with a question from Mr. Abera. I would take the first question. Maybe the second one might be too technical. So the first question was about accessibility and achievability, right? Affordability, I'm sorry, yeah.
Thank you very much. If you look across the continent, the technologies are there. So I think it's a matter really of, if we talk about Ethiopia, I'm not, of course, the EU ambassador to Ethiopia, but to the African Union. But still, if I look across the continent, I think it's a matter of getting, you saw the maps I showed. I saw some of the strategic corridors includes Addis Ababa. I'm sure you saw that. And it's to build on that. And the reason, and it's to have a good strategic discussion of how to use that. If this is one of the places, then you as a national government, you should come to us and say, you know, we really like this idea of being part of a strategic corridor. How do we do this? Because as I said, it's not only roads, it's strategic connectivity corridors. So it comes with both the infrastructure for the digital and for transport and so on. So that would be my suggestion to grab this opportunity and simply build on it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I would just add a thought. It's a more philosophical one. If you decide for a technology, you decide for a result of innovation, but you should be open for further innovation. For example, in Germany, we will probably leave the fuel engines and we might change to electromobility. However, in parallel, we see synthetic fuels and we see the development of hydrogen. And the question is, can we afford to produce so much hydrogen that we can absorb it with our industry and in addition for our traffic? That's not yet clear. We need, at least for the climate change, the green hydrogen for our enterprises, for technological processes. So if we now close the development of engines for synthetic fuels, we might have an impasse in the future because we might not have enough green hydrogen. So what we need is openness for different technologies. And the role of Europe could be to finance several ways of development, and you decide which way you will go, so that you not too early close a way towards one technology, so that you are open for other developments and innovation. I believe this is very important, not to be too exclusive, but to be in the change and prioritization. This was your second question of technology, that you are not too exclusive, that you need to define a point in time where you say, well, let's pursue now this with all endeavor, but not to exclude too early. And this needs science. This needs also empiric dates. This needs also a question of acceptance in the population, as well of environmental acceptance, whether it is feasible to the climate goals. Thank you.
Thank you. And I saw also that Director Abdallah raised his hand.
Thank you very much. Really referring to the question that raised by my brother from Ethiopia. And I think nowadays the renewable energy, all the renewable energy, I can say, except hydrogen, we witnessed for the last 10 years a huge reduction in solar and wind, and even a huge reduction in storage, which make any renewable energy with the storage it is very competitive, even with hydro, which is cheap in Africa. So I think affordability, it is very important for African people. We need affordable technology and we need accessible technology. Nowadays, wind, solar, geothermal, all, I think it is very affordable, and actually it is accessible. And the reason that now this technology is very mature and it can be procured very easily. Of course, with the term of the hydrogen technology, maybe still there are some research need to be done. But as His Excellency Ambassador mentioned, Africa, in terms of the hydrogen, Africa, they have a huge potential of solar energy. And I just refer in one report, which they say that only 0.3% of the potential solar in Sahara region can power all Europe. And this really huge resource that people they can do. And I see even the hydrogen technology is still premature, but I see the potential for Africa to play very good role in terms of hydrogen, and to contribute to make this technology affordable for African continent, and also for our neighbor in Europe or in other area, since hydrogen, it will become the fuel for the future. In terms of Africa, Africa is big, the resource is different. So if you need to choose technology, I think the key word here is the resource. What's the resource you have? The resource in Ethiopia is different from Sudan, is different from Burkina Faso, is different from Nigeria. So normally the technology, it will be dictated by the resource you have. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Auer.
Very briefly, thank you. And I very much agree with what our colleague, African brother, has just said. One thing I just wanted to add, and thank you very much for your question. And thank you also for accepting the invitation to go to the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue. It was very important that His Excellency the Minister went there. I think what you are doing at the moment is extremely important in order to attract exactly the private investments to Ethiopia. What you're doing then to create the enabling environment, namely to reform the power sector, new development of the legislative framework for green hydrogen, what you're doing on PPP modalities, what you've mentioned, this is extremely important. And if you have the conducive environment, if you have the right business environment, then the private investments will come, because the private sector knows where the potential is. They know it, but they need to have the right environment. And I think you're also, you will also see that the private sectors, in particular German economy, the backbone are small and medium-sized enterprises, and they're quite risk aversive, because if they invest in a country, then they are there to come and stay, and they want to invest sustainably to the benefit of the country, but also, of course, to their own benefit. And if this investment fails, then the whole company will fail. So they're very risk aversive. So they are looking in particular into the investment environment. And in that context, also, let me just say very briefly that the instability in the country at the moment is not very conducive, but it is very important that you're doing the right steps into the right direction, which can also help and contribute, to this conducive environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ambassador Markussen, would you like to maybe clarify the question on the resolution? Are there resolutions that need to be ratified in this initiative? Are there, the question from the colleague from Kenya, are there resolutions passed by parties that need to be ratified in this Global Gateway Initiative? Maybe there's a misunderstanding.
I think this is too early to answer that question, because by nature, this initiative is exactly to looking at the continental level. And by the way, I think that's also a new approach. So we're looking at connecting not only internally countries, but actually regions and connecting countries. And what we need there in terms of ratification, I'm not sure. We've done our homework on the European Union side. So there you have, when we developed this package, the Global Gateway, you had everybody in the Team Europe. We had our member states, we have our finance institution, we have also those institutions that could give the guarantees I talked about before, and then we have those where we give the grants. So all that will play together. We have on our side ratified or agreed what needed to be done, but for each of the investments that we're going to see, I'm sure there's some work to be done also here in Africa related to the corridors.
Thank you very much. I will leave it here. And it is now time for coffee. We have the advantage of having Ethiopian coffee here, and the audience in the virtual room, I hope that you can be back here in 15 minutes. And then we will come back together for our second panel, which will be more practical. If you want to hear more and find out more about ongoing initiatives and projects and potential ones and planned ones, I encourage you to come back in 15 minutes. We will have Dr. Johannes Hailu from the UNECA. We will have Dr. Tuwela Nyirenda Njera, who is the head of the Economic Integration Division at the Order NEPAD agency, and we will also have Thomas Ugebert, the head of Cooperation and Policy at the EU delegation to the African Union. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention, and hope to see you soon in a bit. Thank you. And thank you very much again. Thank you, Dr.
Good afternoon, everyone, once again. Good afternoon, once again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the first panel. I for sure did, so I hope it was also interesting to you. It's the end of the day. I'm sure energy levels are going down, but with the coffee and tea that we just provided, I think everybody's refreshed and ready for, I think, even better panel now with very interesting technical discussions on infrastructural development in Africa. Before we go in, I would like to say a few introductory words or statements about what our second panel will be about. But before that, I would like to say we'll have 3 panelists that I will later on introduce one by one. But before that, let me, as I said, I will go in through the introductory remarks. We'll hear from our panelists about infrastructural programs and projects identified by the AU member states and the RECs under the AU's Program for Infrastructural Development, PIDA, which are supported by international partners such as the EU and the UNECA. To tell you some interesting facts, today, as we speak, only 38% of Africa have access to electricity. Less than 10% are connected to the internet, very unfortunately. Only a quarter of Africa's roads are paved, and poor infrastructure is believed to cut Africa's economic growth annually by 2% and cut productivity by 40%. A good number of the projects identified under the Global Gateway Initiative that we've heard about from the EU earlier builds on a project of the Program for Infrastructural Development in Africa, which is also known as the PIDA initiative. And in particular, it builds on the new phase and also the second phase of PIDA and its priority action plan, which runs from 2021 to 2030. PIDA, as you might already know, is an initiative by the AU Commission in partnership with AUDA-NEPAD, Development Agency of the AU, the African Development Bank, and the UNECA. The first PIDA phase run until 2020 comprised 51 programs divided into 433 different projects. The second phase, which was adopted at the last AU summit, has 69 projects, 29 in transport, 18 in energy, 12 in water projects, and 11 ICT projects. An important lesson that I want to bring to your attention that was learned from PIDA 1 was that the program should be more integrated. So we hope that the PIDA 2 will factor that in. Now, without taking much more time, I would like to introduce our three distinguished panelists. I will start with, of course, the panelist who's sitting right here next to me, Mr. Thomas Hegbert, who's the head of policy and cooperation at the EU delegation to the AU in Addis Ababa. Mr. Thomas is originally from Belgium. He studied economics and management. Mr. Thomas holds a degree from the University of Leuven, sorry for my pronunciation, the HEC in Paris. You worked for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, then for the UNDP. In 2003, you joined the AU Commission and worked for External Relations and Development Departments. He looks to an extensive career to questions of development in Africa, which brought him, among others, to Burkina Faso and twice to Ethiopia, where he was first at the bilateral EU delegation to Ethiopia and since 2008 at the EU delegation to the AU. 18. Did I say 8? Sorry. I will now introduce our second panelist, Dr. Towela Nirenda Jire, who's the head of economic integration division at the AUDA-NEPAD. Dr. Towela, as you see, will be joining us virtually from Midrad, South Africa, where AUDA-NEPAD is located. Dr. Towela is a native from Malawi. She's an electrical engineer by education with degrees from University of Malawi and Kansas in the USA, where she also did her PhD. She later also specialized in internet governance at the University of Malta. Dr. Towela later then established an internet governance program at NEPAD and also co-founded the African School of Internet Governance. She has more than 20 years of experience in private sector, academia, and development, and joined NEPAD in 2009. I will now introduce our third panelist, Dr. Johannes Hailu, who's the energy policy expert at the UNECA. Dr. Johannes will also be joining us virtually from Kigali. Dr. Johannes is originally from Eritrea. He is a studied economist with degree from University of Asmara and West Virginia in the US, where he also did his PhD in natural resource economics. Prior to joining the UNECA, he worked as a visiting assistant professor at Michigan State University. At the UNECA, he works as an economic affairs officer at the Energy, Infrastructure and Services section in the Private Sector Development and Finance Division. Now we go straight into to our panel discussion. And then I will if you allow me, direct my first question to Dr. Tuwela. Doctor, with what you heard about the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, how do you see this initiative? And how do you think it can support the AUDA and EPAD in delivering on the implementation of Africa's priority infrastructure projects?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's joining this session. Allow me, first of all, to express my appreciation for the invitation to participate, and to also acknowledge the distinguished speakers in the previous panel, I think, who made some very insightful comments and also provided quite a bit of contextualization for this second panel. I think at the outset, one also needs to acknowledge and commend the EU for developing the Global Gateway Initiative in terms of the principles on which it is founded, in terms of the priority areas that have been also targeted as far as what the initiative will support. And also, I think, in terms of the way in which perhaps the support will be structured and provided to the African Union and its member states. So when one looks at the initiative, I think one can see that there is a concerted effort perhaps to consolidate efforts across the EU member states. And I think that's part of what is the Team Europe approach. And also really looking at what one could perhaps call a happy meeting of the priorities from the perspective of the EU, but also taking into account the priorities of the African Union. I think it has been mentioned in terms of some of the process that has been followed in terms of identifying, for instance, the strategic corridors, and how that has already taken into account perhaps some of the priorities that are well articulated in Agenda 2063, as well as the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA. What I think, when we look at how the initiative perhaps will support AUD and EPAD and AU member states as far as meeting the aspirations of infrastructure, the fact that the initiative recognizes the need to focus on both the hard and soft infrastructure aspects, I think is significant. The fact that the funding is structured in different ways. So you have funding that is very targeted at guarantees and risk mitigation measures. You have grant funding. You have also a specific focus perhaps on green infrastructure, which I think is also very relevant for the continent today. What I think in terms of how the initiative will help is that there will need to be obviously a recognition of what already exists in terms of the various tools and instruments, be it at the level of the Commission, at the level of AUD and EPAD, at the level of the regional economic communities, and even member states themselves. So we'll see the initiative as something that is complementary to what already exists and is working to strengthen existing mechanisms and existing domestic resource mobilization, the participation of private sector, and so on across the continent. The other thing I think that one would hope to see is that the initiative will help in terms of leveraging and unlocking funding across the continent. We recognize that the PIDA PAP2 portfolio has a total bill of about $169 billion to implement the second priority action plan. And we also acknowledge the fact that about $8 billion of that is required to prepare the projects and get them into a state where they can actually be funded and financed by DFIs and other investors. So we hope and expect that the initiative will take into account the need for this early stage project preparation so that these projects that are in the pipeline can actually become bankable and implementable. Lastly, I think the aspect of making sure that the initiative works in a way that perhaps acknowledges the institutional mechanisms and institutional architecture in the continent, insofar as the way in which the regional institutions work with member states, and making sure that we are able to mobilize and harness the respective capacities at the level of member states, at the level of the RECs, at the level of the continental institutions as well. So maybe let me stop there for now, and we can take other questions as they come.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Dr. Tuwela. As a follow-up to my first question, and also building on your answer on how the corridors, strategic corridors should be complementary and not repetitive, I want to ask you, how do you see the strategic corridors identified by the EU to better facilitate trade in Africa in relation to PIDA's integrated corridor approach?
Okay, so I think one of the things that, and I recognize that at some point we talked about the lessons that we learned in terms of the implementation of the first priority action plan of PIDA and how we are translating that into the second PIDA priority action plan. Very important, I think, was the recognition that we needed to look at the integrating nature of infrastructure, but also looking at integrated approaches to how we build the infrastructure. So the PIDA Part 2 is, as you rightly point out, premised on an integrated corridor approach, which is looking at how do we leverage efficiencies in terms of building infrastructure across the 4 sectors, so ICT, energy, transboundary water, and energy, and then also making sure that we are leveraging opportunities to provide the connectivity that is required between our various capitals, that is required in terms of making sure that as the infrastructure goes from one region or country to another, that it is also providing opportunities in terms of rural-urban connectivity, in terms of job creation, as well as addressing issues of resilience. So when you look at the strategic corridors, and I'm sure that one must also acknowledge that they are called strategic for a reason, you can see that there is a bit of an interplay and a bit of a correlation perhaps in terms of the positioning of some of those strategic corridors, as well as some of the projects or corridors that have been identified in the PIDA Priority Action Plan. That I think is very significant. What I think will be the test for all of us is going to be how do we actually implement those corridors across the various countries and take into account the fact that we will be touching different member states, different regions, and really looking at how do we make sure that we are able to harness the collective energies across member states to build those projects. I think there was mention in terms of some of the challenges perhaps that one would face in terms of cross-border and transboundary infrastructure. And I'm hoping that with the support of the EU and through the Global Gateway Initiative, we'll be able to look at some of these things, whether these are issues to do with policy harmonization, regulatory issues, and even the issues around how you actually structure projects that are cross-border and transboundary in nature. So I think the initiative and the strategic corridors themselves give us a lot of opportunities in terms of demonstrating what is actually possible when one takes a very strategic and maybe very systematic approach in terms of how you're actually building out the infrastructure.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Tuwela. Mr. Thomas, let me bring the question to you now and follow up on technical Global Gateway Initiative related questions. In panel 1, then also during Ambassador Markson's keynote remarks, Ambassador disclosed some details and projects identified under the Global Gateway Initiative here in Africa. I would like to talk now more in depth with you about the 11 strategic corridors that the Team Europe Initiative identified to facilitate safe mobility and trade in Africa in line with Agenda 2063 and the AFCFTA. First of all, which are these corridors? And can you please tell us or give us few examples, explain to our audience what this corridors try to achieve?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe I use your mic because it might be a better one. No, thank you very much. More indeed, I think the map would have been well placed, but I think we have the two panelists. But I think, first of all, with the 11 corridors, we've built on the many potential corridors. But the whole plan was how to focus, because I think the EU, we have had the tendency maybe sometimes is to be a bit everywhere, and because when you are everywhere, you may not be seen as much as you want. And I think relate to also some of the comments that have been made, important also to integrate things so that we achieve real results. So what we did and how we identified some of these corridors is, of course, on the one hand, is to make sure that they make economic sense, so that they are really, by bringing and developing this infrastructure nexus, these connections, we have people there, we have skills there, we have potential for the needed transformation and industrialization. And I think so that was a very important element, also looking at value chains. And so how, instead of natural resources being exported, how we are in Africa creating this value addition, and by looking at a number of countries where each one can possibly bring some value added. I think, well, the other thing is, of course, looking at how we can have reliable, green and safe transport and logistics, important element. The connection issues that also have been mentioned by Dr. Tawela, it's about connecting countries, but it is also about connecting rural and urban areas. I think that we've heard a lot already about the integration, but the integration is also to build on many African initiatives. We've heard the PIDA-PAP2 elements, but there is much more than that. Let's take, for instance, a concrete road, the Abidjan Lagos road. It's only about 1,100 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, crossing 5 countries. There, unfortunately, currently, transportation takes up to, I mean, many days. I think it's, if you go, I saw somewhere that it's up to 15 days to do this distance. So what does that mean? There are lots of issues with basic infrastructure, but also with the customs, the borders, the processing of papers, and so on. So therefore, it's extremely important that on this regulatory work, progress is being made, that we associate to the CFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area provisions, and work on this hand in hand with this infrastructure. Also to look at not only, let's say, if there is transport, but what are the gaps in terms of digital in these specific areas, and then complement this. And so if we do this in an integrated way, I think we have much more potential to what I think is the ultimate goal, is to create more jobs and opportunities and transformation. I think from a European point of view, an Africa that is transformed will be an even better partner for Europe, and we will have many more opportunities. I think, well, when the choice of these corridors was also very much, I think, aligned to the PIDA-PAP earlier work, where the EU has been also working closely with the African Union. And I think it's also good to see that out of the, I think, 69 shortlisted PIDA-PAP2 projects, through the corridors, I think we would cover up to 29 of this, which is up to 40% of the PIDA. Of course, as also has been said, now the proof comes into the implementation, and that is the next thing. I think the other element I wanted to add is the Team Europe approach, where we are, in comparison to the past, trying to bring all assets together. I mean, and it's, I think, our parliamentarian from Germany also mentioned that Europe needs to work extremely closely together to have bigger impact, bringing the banks, but also bringing private sector. And I think that's another element that is really part of the cake. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Thomas. You can see it as a follow-up question to what we just discussed about the corridors. So people or the audience here might be wondering as to how the selection criteria goes. So my question would be, what are important indicators and criteria when selecting the corridors, and which role did the prevention of negative impact of the environment, local societies and economies play in the selection of the projects?
Thank you very much. I think more roughly, if you would take the whole continent, there are potentially up to 200 corridors. Through an initial exercise, which was a quantitative analysis, we've worked on the identification and classification, and we got to 55 strategic corridors, looking at issues of the economic potential, looking at the cross-regional aspect of corridors, also the Africa-Europe connectivity, and also what we call systems of cities coastal corridors. After that, we had these 55 corridors, we did a qualitative analysis, and we got it initially to 31 corridors, and through an additional exercise where we again put a number of criteria, quantitative criteria, looking at economy and investments, connectivity and logistics, biodiversity and sustainability, and human development, cities and security. That's how we came to the 11 corridors. Of course, in this whole exercise, as I already said, I mean, we've of course looked at the PIDA PAP, and because we've been very familiar with it, having been supporting a little bit the PIDA PAP2 identification process. But I think that's a little bit on the process and how we got to the 11.
Thank you very much. That really answers my question. Dr. Johannes, I want to now bring you into the discussion so that we talk a bit more in depth about the PIDA initiative, and have you tell us about UNECA's role in the PIDA initiative. Dr. Johannes, as mentioned earlier, UNECA is a partner to PIDA. Can you briefly tell us what and how the UNECA specifically supports the new PIDA 2 program? And if I may add a question, how do you see the success of PIDA so far?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to join my fellow panelists and all of the participants to this discussion. I would have to say I also enjoyed the first part of the discussion, which was quite interesting in terms of painting the broader perspective within which this partnership is being discussed. Before I proceed answering the question, allow me to just pick a few things that caught my attention. One is the whole idea around sustainable connections. I think in all regional projects in the continent, including PIDA and other initiatives, interconnection and interconnected Africa is the prime focus in terms of how long-term development and transformation will come in Africa. So that recognition of that sustainable connection for the benefit of people is, I think, an important approach, as well as the emphasis placed on enabling environment, SDG 7, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of how ECA sees all these processes, ECA, as part of the UN development community, approaches from two perspectives. One is Agenda 2063, which is the articulated long-term development and transformation aspiration of the continent. And second are the mid-term objectives, Agenda 2030, in terms of how different sustainable development goals could be achieved. So that is our fundamental entry point into this discussion in the continent. And of course, we regard PIDA as a fundamental contribution in terms of addressing one of the most pressing development constraints in the continent, which is the issue of infrastructure gap. I think, Madam Moderator, you mentioned some of those gaps at the beginning of this discussion. In terms of how ECA supports the process, as you may know, we are part of the PIDA PAP2 Secretariat as ECA. We are also part of the steering committee. We were quite involved and engaged with all our colleagues at ODA, NEPAD, and AFDB and other partners in terms of learning the lessons from PIDA PAP 1 in terms of what worked, what didn't work, and really bringing those lessons into PIDA PAP 2. And in all of those processes, criteria identification, stakeholder consultation, project prioritization, and the final identification, we were partners to this PIDA 2 process in terms of governance and related processes. But I think it is our relationship to the initiative is beyond that. ECA runs different programs under Clean Dev Africa initiative, which is looking at climate resilient infrastructure development at national and regional levels, which is being recognized in this process. We also support AFSAM, the African Single Electricity Market, the medium to long-term broader strategy on electricity market development in the continent. We also support the Continental Transmission Master Plan Development Initiative by the African Union Commission. But we also focus on the financing angle, because this is one of the areas where implementation is usually constrained. And we do believe that regional initiatives and national initiatives should seriously open up to the possibility of scaled up private sector participation, domestic, regional, and international, as well as provide different instruments for private-public partnership. So that's how we are engaged in supporting the PIDA process. In terms of what are the successes, what has been achieved under PIDA 1, my sister, Dr. Twela, I think, tried to allude to some of them. We believe the very notion that Africa can plan together regionally, even at the conceptual level, is a fundamental contribution without actually designing it to be a contribution to the process. Since 2012, when PIDA regional infrastructure planning, regional development was conceptualized, translated into actual regional projects, and implementation effort was done, a lot of continental initiatives came since, including the African Continental Free Trade Area. We do know without a successful PIDA, infrastructure on the ground, logistics on the ground, some of these ambitious continental achievements would have been much more complicated. So in that sense, I would say that is one broader contribution of PIDA without it being the designing element of PIDA. But in terms of actual statistics, I think from the last assessment, more than 16,000 kilometers of roads, more than 4,000 kilometers of railway built, more than 3,500 kilometers of interstate transmission lines put in place, more than 17 countries interconnected through regional ICT projects, and so on and so forth. So PIDA has been quite instrumental, successful in some cases, but where I see it can be more impactful under the second round is really looking at issues of investment and finance, and how we can unlock some of the bottlenecks that were experienced in the first phase that affected implementation. Let me stop here for now, and I will join to more of the discussion a bit later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johannes, for your answer. And I want to now ask you a broader question, but that you can answer maybe briefly. Well, what do you think are the main challenges for attracting investment to the continent? And what role do you think good governance and corruption play?
Thank you for that question. I think as we touched upon it, and I think it's alluded to in a lot of the discussion so far, enabling environment, regulation, governance, all of these things are pointing in one direction. Do we have an environment that is reliable, that is predictable, that is regarded as safe for major investment to come in national and then in the more complicated space of regional projects, and how do we package them? So in that sense, one of the major constraints we have, which is pointed repeatedly in numerous United Nations assessments, African Development Bank, African Union, ODA, NEPAD assessments on these infrastructure projects, is the issue of policy and regulation. In many cases, especially if you look at electricity market investment, in some cases it's difficult to bring in investment because current regulations do not permit certain business models to be operational, including cross-border trade, as well as the trade between different parties within the same institution, because we have, in many cases, market structures that do not permit certain business practices. This, of course, limits how much investment can come in. We have actually an initiative on a thorough and in-depth assessment of the regulatory environment in Africa. So we have a more tailored discussion, not a broader general painting of Africa is risky, Africa is corrupt, Africa is this. I don't think that discussion will be helpful. So we have developed, with partnership with African Union and regional and continental regulatory associations, a rigorous methodology that looks at, is Africa open for business? We have criteria for what we mean by open. Its current regulation creates an attractive electricity market, and is Africa's electricity market ready for investment? Using the three criteria in-depth investigation, we have now produced assessment for 17 African countries in terms of a very detailed review of private sector related constraints and challenges emanating from policy and regulation. And we believe this very targeted and dedicated conversation with member states would help taking the regulation and policy discussion in the right direction. And since a lot of these issues are also common, we are now working with the African Union to develop the continental framework for electricity market regulation and private sector investment. And we have actually next week here in Kigali, in Rwanda, where I'm connected from, a discussion with partners from Europe, partners from the African Union, and other partners in this work, to discuss the initial architecture of that framework to take it forward. So we believe that would provide a continental framework and guideline how to deal with regulation in a very methodical and thorough way, in the way that addresses a lot of the concerns coming from the private sector, domestic and international private sector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johannes. Dr. Tuwela, I'm going to come to you now. And I want to bring back the discussion to the Global Gateway Initiative and the plans on securing digital infrastructure. In the first panel, we heard that the Global Gateway Initiative is also about securing digital infrastructure. With your background that you later gained in internet governance, I would like to know how important you find issues of protection of critical infrastructure and data protection are for digitization in Africa.
Thank you very much. So maybe to respond to that question directly, I think we're all aware that as insofar as having come out of the various lockdowns and other measures that we had to go through during COVID-19, and which we still will continue to go through for some time, that the ability to use digital services for all aspects of life, I think, has been highly amplified, but it has also then exposed perhaps some of the weaknesses in terms of the infrastructure on the continent, as well as the delivery of critical services as well. Now, one must also perhaps, in having this discussion, perhaps also frame it in the context of the fact that digitalization perhaps permeates a lot of different things. So even as we're talking about infrastructure per se, we have to be thinking about how digitalization serves and becomes integrated and embedded in our energy systems, for instance, in our transport systems as well, in water and utilities. So we have to see it as something that, on the one hand, we are building ICT infrastructure per se, but at the same time, we're looking at how that infrastructure is then going to support the various services across the other sectors. In that regard, the issues around, first of all, being able to identify what is critical infrastructure is important. And that critical infrastructure is not only the fiber optic cables and networks and data centers that are providing us these services. It is also the infrastructure such as our energy connectivity that is riding and sitting on top of that. So we need to be able to, number one, identify what is critical infrastructure, and then put in place the mechanisms that are going to protect that infrastructure, both on a physical level, but also in terms of being responsive to cyber incidents, cyber attacks, and so on. At the level of the African Union, I think a lot has been done in terms of the policy and regulatory and side of it, as far as defining the AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, which is really meant to provide a framework for member states to actually articulate the way in which we would implement the various measures and institutional measures that would be needed to make sure that we are addressing issues of cybersecurity. We are at the point now where we are still awaiting the coming into entry of that convention in terms of having the requisite number of ratifications, but work is still ongoing in terms of building up some of these various institutions. So looking at cyber emergency response teams, looking at capacity building so far as it supports cybersecurity, and then also trying to have a very good understanding of how as AU member states we can be maybe more proactive as far as building our networks in a way that is cyber resilient. I think coupled to that, at the level of services that citizens enjoy, the issues of data protection, I think, cannot be ignored, and the fact that we need to make sure that even as we're talking about the continental free trade area and being able to trade, whether it's trading goods and services, that there is a need to make sure that those transactions are secure, that people have the confidence to be able to actually transact using our various platforms and services, and that the ordinary citizens understand the issues around privacy, data protection, and so on. Coupled with that, I think, is also the issue of the protection of children online. And I'm aware that, again, at the level of the Commission, they are addressing issues around digital identity, issues around data protection, and then very specifically this idea of child online protection. What I would say perhaps in closing is the fact that I think digitalization opens up a lot of opportunities in terms of the creation of local content, local industries by Africa's youth that would actually enable us to provide all these digital and e-services that we are aspiring to provide, not only in terms of the CFTA itself, but also in terms of the added industrialization and local industries that could be created as a result of digital transformation.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Tawela. Mr. Thomas, I'm now going to come to you. We've talked about the Global Gateway Initiative, the plans and the design of the implementations, but now I want us to talk about money. When we hear about the budgets involved, 300 billion euros in general for the Global Gateway and 150 billion euros for projects in Africa, as announced at the recent EU-AU summit in Brussels, this of course creates expectations. On the other hand, infrastructure is also very costly. First of all, I would like to know how important the EU's contribution can be if we know that the African Development Bank estimates the annual cost to meet Africa's infrastructural needs lies between 130 to 170 billion US dollars. How important would you say is it to find other source of funding?
Well, I think the first step is indeed when its member states are pooling their forces together. And also, I think my ambassador mentioned it already, to see also how the European Investment Bank, which is such an important actor, starts to do more and more with us in Africa. And so when we can pool all this together with also private sector, our calculations for the period 22 to 27 is a relatively cautious number. So we think that once we are moving ahead with projects through grants, to guarantees, to blending and loans, we should easily arrive to that number. And this is also important because we know how big the needs are for infrastructure development. But then, having said that, it's of course not enough. And I think at the EU-AU summit, one of the other conclusions was to give up some of the special drawing rights of the IMF that European Union member states have received to transfer them to African countries, because we know that the balance there is not correct. And so while this is, of course, an initiative where individual member states need to contribute funds, it is an important one where we see further traction. Besides this, of course, domestic resource mobilization is extremely important. And we've seen it in the past. You look at the history, I mean, even in the recent past, that's where most money. We need, and we are accompanying countries in improving public finance management and increasing possible investments from that side. We've mentioned before the importance of the regulatory framework, the enabling environment, the African single electricity market, but also I think in terms of the digital, there is also not only the digital transformation strategy of the African Union, but I think we are also moving to a market. All these are elements to give confidence and will help these infrastructure developments to move. On the quality of the pipeline of projects, I think we are working hand in hand with our African partners, with our NEPAD in particular, because that is also how you attract more money, possibly just from the private sector too. And then I think also is not to forget about the quality of infrastructure is so important in this whole, where there might be differences with other actors on the continent. Sometimes we are not making the calculation. We think that at the first sight it's cheaper one way, but then you have such big costs in maintenance and refinancing needs already before you have started to repay your loan. So I think that's another way of making sure that the money is well used. And last but not least, I think as part of the piece, we support initiatives such as the 5% agenda. And the 5% agenda is a campaign to increase allocations of African asset owners to African infrastructure. Currently, it's only at 1.5% of their assets under management. And so the push would be to get to the 5%. Furthermore, what we also see is that global regulations reducing the amount of bank capital available for Africa infrastructure will be more there. I mean, so even pension funds and others from all over the world should be made more available for specific investments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer, Mr. Thomas. Dr. Johannes, I'm going to come back to you since we just talked about budget with Mr. Thomas and ask you about source of funding. Energy infrastructure projects and infrastructure projects just in general have a significant cost. What role would you say the private sector play, and how successful was PIDA, but perhaps also other initiatives supported by the UNECA in attracting the private sector? And if you could give us examples.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think to provide a bit of context through why we really believe attracting private sector capital is absolutely crucial for Africa's development. Already prior to COVID-19 environment, we were really looking at ways of how we can sustain major infrastructure expenditure in the continent. As you know, more than 90% of infrastructure development in the last decade came as a result of public expenditure, as well as complemented by bilateral and multilateral financing and support from development finance institutions. In fact, by 2018, already the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa was telling us only 3% of infrastructure investment in the continent is coming from the private sector. So that is absolutely a negligible role that was coming from the private sector. Now, the concern was we cannot sustain that kind of model because already tax to GDP ratio in Africa is on average around 13%. it would require to mobilize significant amount of domestic resources to sustain a publicly driven infrastructure project. And we knew in advance that was quite a risky model, considering that we need to keep on developing our infrastructure and meet a lot of the development milestones. Then COVID came, which complicated the environment. As you know, the priority went to social protection, public health, where a lot of public expenditure went in the last 2-3 years, and continuing to do so. And that further narrowed the ability of public spending to be sustained in the next decade on Africa's national and regional infrastructure projects. So that is a bit a complex environment to be in. So we believe how do you finance this particular arrangement of infrastructures across different areas requires a little bit different thinking in terms of financing. On ECA side, I would say the same African Union or the NEPAD, based on the experience of PIDA-PAB2, we need to really figure out how to bring in scaled investment from the private sector to Africa, both continental and international private sector. Without it, for example, to finance all of the SDG goals, 16 of them, plus partnership member 17, requires about $1 trillion a year across the continent. In energy, probably around, he said, 130 to 170. So it is not realistic anymore not to expand the funding model. So talking about private sector finance has become absolutely critical. That is why discussions about de-risking, creating enabling environment, predictable policy, good regulation, good governance become non-optional at this point. So that's why we continue to support rigorous review of the regulatory environment, putting the right framework guided by the African Union, and supporting member states to address serious regulatory problems. For example, a lot of the projects identified by PIDA-PAB2 are of interstate transmission infrastructure. Transmission infrastructure had serious regulatory issues at national level. When you take it regional, the complexity expands. So how do we really bring proper regulation that transforms the energy sector into a well-functioning market and not necessarily encumbered by legacy policy or regulatory issues? The second one associated to unlocking this private sector finance issue is the issue of private-public partnership. We see the public sector still would continue to have a significant role in Africa in terms of infrastructure uptake. However, can we package successful PPP projects? We have very good examples. For example, the West African pipeline is on the basis of a successful PPP model. We also have transmission infrastructure experimented under a PPP model. However, we need to have to understand really good framework, mitigate potential risk, and package successful blend of funding. So that's why we're working now with 6 African countries to come up with a pipeline of regional PPP supported projects in Uganda, Kenya, in Malawi, in Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and so on and so forth. We're really working with them to identify this PPP supported. Then, of course, the third element is partnership. That's why this global gateway partnership is quite interesting contribution to the solution mix in terms of how we finance. I personally like the approach that it is conscious of the prevailing development paradigm and agenda in Africa. It's talking about PIDA, which is our regional infrastructure development absolute priority and corridor and so on and so forth. We talked about on the trade side, in the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think it is absolutely wise to look at what is prevailing in terms of infrastructure, enhance it, improve it, and help us go to implementation. In that sense, we do need SDG 17 to accelerate finance, including bilateral, multilateral, continental initiatives. And I think it's quite exciting to hear that Africa is prioritized under this 150 billion euro cooperation envelope. And more of these initiatives, I think, would add for us to not only achieve the PIDA goals, but also we have on top of that Agenda 2063, Agenda 2030. A lot of that require really a significant amount of resources. But some of this we believe would add to the solution.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johannes, and thank you very much, the distinguished panelists, for answering all my questions. The questions from my side have all ended, and I want to open the floor for questions from panelists in the room.
Thank you. I'm Tamana from Ministry of Trade and Regional Integration. I just appreciate the Gateway, the Global Gateway Initiative. It enhances Africa-EU ties and benefit both regions. My question is coming to the Mr. Thomas. The first question is, yes, you already mentioned how you select the 11 corridors. My idea is the stakeholder participation issues. How you participated, for example, PIDA, how PIDA is succeed, or the challenge of PIDA have. I believe the project should be bridge the gap of the PIDA, in my perspective. So the challenge should be incorporated into this initiative. So, for example, how you communicate with the PIDA implementation, progressive of the PIDA, how you get the data for the implementation of the PIDA. And the other thing is that how you communicate or participated the member state. You see the member state have different potential, yes. Their need is maybe different. For example, as my understanding or perspective, now as a country, as a continent, transport is very key. Digitalization also key. Energy is very important. So, however, as a continent, we have a shortage, but some countries, how they are different even on this issue. So the interest of the country should be incorporated into this initiative. So the other question is, yes, as you mentioned, the budget is very limited. The 100 billion is not enough for all these projects or gaps. So how this budget is allocated for each member state? What is your allocation criteria, or the project will be allocated on the two facilitate, especially the ACFTA continental trade? This is very conscious and very important for all the continent-wide member states. So my question is, for the time being, it is enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My sincere thanks to the CAST team and the moderator yourself and the panelists. My question will be, what does the global gateway infrastructure in Africa, definitely the EU support in this respect, going to prepare our respective African countries to benefit from the current Africa's trade bill, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? As you all know, we are trading not more than 16% among ourselves within the continent. We trade much better to Europe, much better to North America in the percentage. Definitely building our continental in-house capacity will boost our capacity to trade much better to Europe and also to North America. So is this support of the EU really helping us to pave the way so that we can really do facilitate intra-Africa trade. I also wonder, most of the corridors you had been mentioning is more on the land transport and logistics. I think the continent is having a serious problem of air transport, which in many ways investment on that might be expensive, but again, trading, adding air transport to the facilitating in intra-Africa trade makes much more sense, complementing the land logistics. So is there any thought in those areas? Because like for me, when I was traveling to Canada, it was much cheaper than traveling to one of the West African countries by air. So, I mean, air logistics will be also a focus. So is there any thought on that? Because I haven't heard any one of you speaking on air transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I will start with the last question. Well, on the air transportation, let's be very clear. We are working hand in hand with the African Union and the single African transport market, air aviation transport market, where exactly what is, I mean, trying to be achieved is indeed a regulated market where also competition is possible, and where therefore the price of travel will be going down. I mean, again, the European Union, it's our bread and butter to do these kind of things, because we are, I mean, we have our experience of integrating our member states and creating single markets, and we've seen how much advantage it has brought to facilitate. And so I think on the second bit, the global gateway is indeed what is most important, and I mentioned it earlier in our discussion, is that for us, the best result would be that Africa and African countries do much more business with each other. And so therefore, of course, the CFTA is a key tool. It is on the whole software, and it's to take barriers away, so that possibilities for doing trade with each other are much more easy. And I think therefore the global gateway and CFTA are for us allies for an agenda, because I think this is a different agenda that not other actors, I will not name them, have. I mean, we have a genuine interest in seeing this value addition being made, this transformation, this industrialization happening. For instance, we've talked about vaccine and medicine manufacturing. I hope that, for instance, the electric car batteries of the future, instead of having the natural resources going somewhere, are being used here and transformed into industries where you have also the manpower more than available. On the other question of the gentleman of the Ministry of Trade and Regional Integration, I'm just trying to see. No, I think on the link with PIDA-PAP, as I said, I mentioned it already before. I think a lot of the PIDA-PAP projects coincide with the corridors that have been identified. And so besides that, the EU and the African Union with ODA, NEPAD and AOC, we are working on a day-to-day basis together. And we've already foreseen that for some of the investments, there would be also kind of global steering, strategic steering committee, where the AU would be with us together on the choice of and on the guidance needed for specific investment. Afterwards, of course, beyond this continental level, indeed, there are projects that are purely national, and there again, there we have our mechanisms where we work with our bilateral missions, with the embassies, the banks, and the national authorities, and so of course the plan is to integrate those things as much as possible. In terms of having really an allocation for country, I think we are talking about essentially integrated projects where you go beyond the country. I mean, if you're talking about connectivity and about enhancing the business between countries, you need to build those bridges. Sometimes it's the transmission line between different countries, that is, the broadband cables that are connecting countries. So there, I don't think we are working with prefixed envelopes, but it's more like in partnership with existing structures, with Africans and African Union, work together on most importantly, get to results and implement as many things as possible. Thank you.
I will take just 2 more questions as we're running out of time. Madame Nomahalle.
Merci pour la parole. Bonsoir à tous. Je suis Monsieur Julio Candolo, responsable de toutes les questions liées au partenariat au sein de l'ambassade de la République démocratique du Congo. Je m'exprime en français parce que c'est la langue que je maîtrise le mieux. Ma question, je l'adresse au professeur Johannes. Oui, je reprends. Je m'appelle Monsieur Julio Candolo. Je suis responsable de questions liées au partenariat au sein de l'ambassade de la République démocratique du Congo. Ma question, je l'adresse au professeur Johannes. Professeur Johannes, la phase 2 du PIDA reprend tout un tas de projets. Et vous venez de dire tantôt que parmi ces projets-là, il y a des projets qui sont prioritaires. Ma question, c'est quels sont les projets que le PIDA a retenu comme prioritaires, et si vous pouvez nous dire quels sont les critères de sélection, quels sont les critères qui vous ont permis de dire, par exemple, que tel projet est prioritaire par rapport à d'autres. Merci beaucoup.
The one at the back, and then I'm sorry, we have to close.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and congratulations, and thank you very much for the various presentations and insights from the panelists. My name is Kennedy Lueya. I represent the ambassador to the Republic of Malawi in Ethiopia, who is also a permanent representative to the African Union. My question is very closely related to the last question that has come from our colleague from the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the sense that right now I'm looking at the Global Gateway document, which has the investment package for the strategic corridors. My concern equally, which is the concern for Malawi, is on the criteria for the selection of the corridors. For example, you outlined that one of the reasons for choosing these priority corridors or recommended corridors is to facilitate in the updating and harmonizing of regulatory frameworks. Now, when you go to the recommended corridors, you've got a very beautiful map in there. You see that some of the corridors that have been identified, for example, in Southern Africa, that link countries such as South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, Walvis Bay, Namibia, you know, those corridors, as much as I would say they are useful, but I would say they are already pretty much developed in comparative terms to the other corridors that have been left out. For example, if you look at that map, you will see that in Eastern Central Africa, there is a glaring gap. And I guess that's the reason why our colleague from DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, has raised that question on the criteria. The reason is the area that has been left out on the Central African aspect there, Central and Eastern Africa, that's an area that has a huge potential, where I would like to propose that you need to add a corridor that would probably be the 12th recommended corridor that can run from the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in the city of Lubumbashi, linking to Lusaka, and then linking to Lilongwe in Malawi, and then goes all the way to the port of Nakara in Mozambique. That would open up in the northern part of Mozambique. That's an area where you have these huge gas reserves that are being exploited by Total. With the current Russia-Ukraine crisis, which was referred to, we have a serious potential problem in future in terms of energy security, particularly in relation to access to gas. Yet Mozambique can supply the bulk of some of that gas to meet the needs, most of the needs that Europe gas needs are, including, of course, African countries as well. So I'd like to recommend that corridor that runs from DRC, Eastern DRC, to Lusaka, Lilongwe, and then onwards to to Nakala port in Mozambique. If that would be exchanged for something, I would propose that, you know, this corridor, which is referred to as the Maputo-Gaborone-Walvis Bay corridor, except for Mozambique in that group of countries, the rest are actually under the Southern African Customs Union. And these countries are very well integrated. You know, you look at the infrastructure there, South Africa has some of the best infrastructure in the world. I mean, it favorably competes with a lot of European countries. If you look at the, you know, in comparative terms, South Africa could probably be in the top 15 countries in the world in terms of connectivity. So I don't see the reason why South Africa appears on two, you know, corridors at the expense of other countries that are landlocked and yet have serious potential for contributing to the economic development of, you know, their countries as well as Africa, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, Zambia, Malawi, and then Mozambique on the other side. So that's the proposal that I would provide. I don't need an answer to that for now, but it's a position that you might wish to consider. Luckily, you have said in this document, there is a footnote that this is still work in progress. So I hope that that point can be taken, and then we can discuss later, you know, in terms of whether it has been taken up or not. Thank you.
May I ask who your question is addressed to?
No. That's why I'm saying mine is more of a proposal. It doesn't need to be answered. It's a point that I would like to be taken. I would like that corridor to be considered. I've named it as the DRC, Lubumbashi, Lusaka, Lilongwe, Nakara corridor as the 12th proposed recommended corridor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The colleague who asked the question in French before, because I missed the beginning, okay, it's to Dr. Johannes, and he will take it now.
Thank you. I think the interpretation was not very clear. However, I understood what he was saying with a little French that I understand. I think my understanding is he's asking what were the criteria applied in the selection of PIDA-PAB2 projects, with the implication that perhaps he may also be thinking other corridors that may or may not have been included. Let me just briefly say two things. One, in terms of the criteria, my sister, Dr. Tuela, can also assist me here. The selection criteria considered three elements. One is that this project enhanced to a significant degree the regional integration agenda. That being looked in terms of this project regional, are there clear agreements among the countries that would be involved in that particular regional project? Is there a consensus? Do they also agree to enhance regional integration for that particular infrastructure for that particular region? So there are a number of indicators, basically testing projects by this criteria. Remember, there are more than 242 projects initially submitted, which would have to be streamlined. The second thing is learning from the first experience. Is this inclusive and sustainable? Are these projects sustainable, which will lead you into issues of not only financial sustainability, but also issues around climate change and resilient infrastructure development, and so on and so forth. So this whole area of sustainability, but inclusivity in a sense, a lot of these regional projects are viewed as not having much to do with rural development, So there was a perception that rural development needs to be really taken into account in terms of how different projects would be selected. The third element is, of course, the economic and financial impact aspect, impact in terms of job creation, income potential, and so on and so forth, but also in terms of would this project be economically viable and attractive to investors, because investment is a key element of implementation. Therefore, is it a high potential project to attract investment, which also promises economic impact? So as far as I understand, these were the considerations that were taken into account in the final selection of the 69 or so projects, about 18 or so in the energy sector. But I'm particularly not worried about this because what we call it clusters happen by design or organically. For example, a number of countries can initiate other regional initiatives within or outside of PIDA that have also regional infrastructure development potential. This is not the exhaustive list of what Africa could do in terms of regional initiative. I agree, it could be gas pipeline, which is something we strongly support as well. It could be regional new electricity market integration. For example, we have done a study on the logistical implications of implementing CFTA to increase intra-African trade to about, say, 54%. What is the logistical implications? And we find out Africa would need, for example, to invest about $53 billion in truck transport, about $9 billion in rail wagon, about $26 billion in new airplanes to service that kind of additional demand in air transport, which my sister mentioned earlier. So this analysis naturally led into identification of logistical hubs in Africa. Are this design now? No, that's what the model is showing us. So regions, it could be Central Africa, it could be East Africa, that have strategized quick enough, put a plan quick enough, could actually develop the likelihood that there would be a hub for truck transport, for railway, for air transport, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the strategy is open, a lot of the possibilities open. PIDA is a slice of the regional projects proposal on the basis of the criteria I just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johannes, and thank you very much, our dear participants attending here physically and also those joining us virtually. Thank you all very much for joining us today. With this, we close the session, the panel discussions and the event for today. I thank you all. Have a good evening. Just one note, please, there's a reception organized for you. So please attend the reception just outside the conference room. And as you're leaving and also enjoying a drink, please fill out the evaluation form, the QR code that has been passed around on your tables. Please scan it with your phone and fill in the evaluation forms. Thank you very much.